Hello. Sawadika, good morning everyone. And thank you, Taiwia, for the invitation. And I'm glad to be here to be sharing the experience of the Global Wind Energy Council in preparing our work program and strategies to ensure that we see the mobilization of offshore wind in our key markets, and that's in Vietnam, Philippines, South Korea, and Japan. And I have to admit, I understand none from Kun Wacharapong's speech, but the fact that we are all here gathered, it means, and it seems like Thailand is ready to mobilize offshore wind. And based on the number of attendants in the room, it seems that we have that vast and really roaring support to make it happen. And of course, from the Global Wind Energy Council, we are very much willing to extend our support as well in terms of how we could, together with the private sector and also the government and the platform provided uh, from the association, so we could have that collaborative effort again to realize the offshore wind vision and the overall RE vision for Thailand as well, similar to how we envision it in our key markets, especially in Philippines and Vietnam. So thank you for inviting us as well. So maybe this is I'm tasked to discuss about Philippines, our case studies in the Philippines, Vietnam, and also our regional work to support these countries. So I have this agenda. I hope that I don't bore you because it will be a quite a long presentation, but I will be here until this afternoon if you have questions that you want to ask GWEC, and I hope I could answer those questions and really just try to engage with everyone in the room. Um, but yeah, maybe before we start with our strategies, I have four slides coming from our last global offshore wind report. And I wanted to show here where we are right now globally when it comes to offshore wind installation. What you see in the screen is our figure for 2024. So it's just a headline figure there. We have added 8 gigawatt of new capacity for offshore wind globally, making 2024 as the fourth highest year for new installations. So you can see there that the first is 2021. We've seen 21 gigawatt installation for that year, and then it sort of went down from 2022 to 2024. If we want to understand how that happened and where we can see most of these offshore wind installations, we have a figure here that you can see on your screen, wherein we further broke down the capacity by market and by region. So I think there is no surprise there. That figure would show us the breakdown for just for year 2024, so that's 8 gigawatt. And what you see here is the total global installation as of 2024, which we're looking at 83.2 gigawatt total offshore wind installation. So again, no surprise, China is leading the capacity. Half of what we're seeing right now globally is actually installed in China. If we further look into APAC as a region, the top contributors for that would be China, Taiwan, and South Korea. The rest would be outside APAC, and that's concentrated in Europe, in the region of Europe. So it's a similar story from what we see just on the year 2024 and what we see globally, like the total installation. Okay, but I mean, we've been hearing about headwinds specific to offshore wind, but this is our projection, Global Wind Energy Council's projection until 2034. So the fundamentals of offshore wind is still very strong. It has not changed, and the midterm outlook for us remains the same. Um, Despite the sector facing so many challenges, we see that there's still a huge opportunity, especially from 2030 to 2034. We are looking at a compound average annual growth of 28% until 2029. And then we see 15% from 2029 to 2034. But what we're seeing in terms of total installation is that we will sail past 30 gigawatt by 2030 and 50 gigawatt by 2033. So again, our market intel expects 350 gigawatt of new offshore wind capacity to be added over the next decade. So that's a huge number for us to expect. And you can see there that, in terms of the market breakdown, we're expecting it, again, of course, to be coming from China, from Europe, but you see that there's a huge installation now that we're expecting from the Asia-Pacific region. And this is for both floating and fixed, but we see floating wind isn't likely to reach commercialization until the end of this decade. So we see some pilot projects for the floating sector, but again, commercial probably towards the end or after the end of this decade. And maybe just some key points for us to remember, and this is would say the framework wherein GWEC, believes that we need to be, as a country, as a sector, to be really focused on. 6 things that we want to just have this as a snapshot of what we believe we should be doing and should be concentrating our efforts on. First, the offtake mechanism. So in other emerging markets or mature markets, we're now looking at auctions as a key offtake mechanism for the delivery. Of course, some new markets would start with the feed-in tariff, but as now we're moving towards a more mature market ending the FIT scheme, so we're looking at auctions for that. We're looking into how we could further streamline and fast-track permitting for the developers to go through from the consenting pre-development until construction and operations. We're looking at finance as a key enabler for us as a sector to realize the offshore wind vision. We're looking at supply chain as well. We're looking at key infrastructure as such as grid and port. We need to have these infrastructures ready before we can even actually realize the full construction and operations of an offshore wind asset. And of course, last but not the least, we need to reclaim the narrative on RE or on offshore wind energy. In other markets such as Australia, we've been seeing some misinformation and disinformation relevant to offshore wind. And again, as a sector, we need to reclaim why we're doing this beyond climate change, beyond energy security. We need to extend the narrative to how can our communities benefit from actually putting offshore wind in our coastal areas. So those key things as part of a strategy and a framework for development, that's something that we use in how we would want to advocate for the offshore wind deployment globally. Okay, so those 4 slides, again, they came from the latest Global Offshore Wind Report, which you can actually download from our website. It would present you all the data from relevant markets and also some thought leadership and pieces and papers relevant to our key markets key markets globally. You can download that. But now I wanted to focus on the strategy specific to the APAC region. So if you can see there, GWEC, this is sort of our capacity vision for offshore wind. We're looking at installing between 6 to 14 gigawatt of offshore wind across our key markets, as mentioned earlier, Vietnam, Philippines, Japan, and South Korea. So what we've done is, coming from that global framework that I've shown earlier, we tried to contextualize it and have a strategy that will really fit the Asian market. What we found out is that we have identified here 4 parameters or what we love to call our offshore wind pillars. These are important pillars for us to start developing and constructing and hopefully in the future operating offshore wind within this region. So the first 2 boxes that you see in the screen says there's target sectoral target setting, and our route to market. So this is something that we've done in Philippines and Vietnam over the last 2 years. We collaborated with the government and the sector to understand how much can we really put in terms of capacity in that specific market. So that includes pipeline setting, understanding what the government wants to see in terms of annual capacity build out for a new technology such as offshore wind, and how will that fit in the total market, the total supply from the energy planning sector of the government. So we've been working in Vietnam and Philippines. We've been working not just with the developers but also the government to sort of have a pipeline that we can see this target, that anything between 6 gigawatt to 14 gigawatt over the next decade or so. After that target setting, we then move to the next pillar, which is the route to market. And for us, these are key action items wherein the developers would need a framework or a policy for them to move forward to the development stage, or even the getting the seabed consenting stage. So under the route to market, we have several activities related to the marine spatial planning, for example, relevant to leasing, permitting, and this is where we put our revenue or offtake mechanism efforts. So whether it's CFD, FIT, or auctions, or corporate PPAs, all of these are parked under the route to market strategy. So these two are key pillars for GWEC, and this is how we sort of enter an emerging market, by ensuring that we work with the sector to touch on these two important pillars. And then we go to the third and fourth pillars, which we think are like the third one, we call the enablers, because these are outside the offshore wind asset, but would be very much important for us to even start constructing. So here we put finance, because as you know, it's a new technology. In the Philippines, for example, it's an emerging market. It will be hard for the local commercial banks to do the project financing on their own. So in terms of finance, we try to understand how the multilateral banks like World Bank, ADB, and IFC can help the local commercial banks, so we can gather much capital, further de-risk the market, so they can enter and finance this new technology in an emerging market like the Philippines, and probably like Vietnam and Thailand as well. One of the key enablers also is the supply chain. So we know that 90% of our supply chain or value chain is coming from China, and what we know how disruptions such as war and etc. would have a huge effect on this whole value chain. So again, as an enabler, we're trying to understand how we can take advantage of the local capabilities within the APAC region, and see if we can further build up these industries so that we don't just rely in one country. It's not saying that we want to remove China from the whole equation or value equation. It's just that we want to also understand if we can further upgrade what we have, for example, in Thailand, in Philippines, Vietnam, and etc., and make it robust so that it could support the supply chain in the APAC region as well. And then others would be workforce. Again, the readiness. Do we have enough engineers? Do we have enough marine workers to support offshore wind? In the Philippines, the quick answer is no, we don't have those. And maybe even in Vietnam. I don't know about Thailand. But there is a need for us as early as now to understand the capability of the workforce to support a huge infrastructure development such as offshore wind. And of course, as mentioned earlier, we need to look into the readiness of our grid to take in this much capacity from offshore wind. We need to have ports to support the construction of offshore wind as well. And then, beyond finance, maybe in the future, we can look into carbon market. But yeah, those work streams or work activities, we all park under the enablers. And then last, definitely not the least, we call the guardrail policies or principles. Under the whole just energy transition, we have to ensure that we look into the environmental effects. We need to look into how the communities can work together with the developers and the government to ensure that our fisher folks, the same users of the marine space, wouldn't be left behind. And there's an understanding how the developers and other users of the marine space could work together to deploy offshore wind in that area. So we put here all the relevant consenting mechanism with the community, stakeholder engagement, indigenous people, for example, and fisher folks, as I mentioned. I'm not sure about in Thailand, you're landlocked, but maybe presence of other users of the marine, of that space, for example, should be really part of the discussion together with the developers and the government. So this four is our framework for APAC region, and this is what we bring whenever we enter a new market or a market that would say we're now ready to mobilize or to look into offshore wind. This is how we sort of present it so that the sector, the local sector, the government could also understand where they are at. Do they have a pipeline? Do they have a plan? If yes, do they have the route to market? Do they have the infrastructure? And what's the status of them engaging with the community? So we think that we're sort of covering everything here, but we sort of have a targeted strategy and further combine them and identified all of these pillars. So it's a snapshot. It's not so hard to sort of remember. At least you know these four, and we see this as a successful model in the Philippines and Vietnam, which I will discuss to you in a while. It's the same, but this is onshore wind. So it's almost the same, but what you see is different would be the target. So if we have 6 to 14 for offshore, of course, it's larger for onshore, it being a more mature market in these countries, it being a more mature technology in these countries. So you see there, we have a 50 gigawatt target for onshore in Vietnam, Philippines, Japan, and South Korea. But the target, I mean the pillars, they stay the same. Okay. So now I wanted to go on and discuss the Philippines. So I am, by the way, from the Philippines. I'm from Manila. I am the country manager for Philippines. So I handle the strategy for the Philippine market. And I want to start with this Philippine Energy Transition Pathway, which is the Philippine Energy Plan. So we're quite lucky because if you remember the four pillars, the first step is already done, meaning the government already allotted a specific capacity for offshore wind in the Philippine Energy Plan. So it's already enshrined there. So we didn't have to do much in terms of prodding them. They accepted that Philippines has a huge opportunity to enable offshore wind, so they already enshrined it in our official energy plan. And what you can see here, it might be small, but we have two scenarios in the Philippines. So we have the clean energy scenario 1, and what you just need to remember there is we want 50% of our e-share in our portfolio by 2040, and 19 gigawatt of 19 gigawatt will be coming from offshore wind by 2040 or 2050. So already you could see the huge slot given to offshore wind and RE in general for the Philippines. And then we have a more aggressive target, which is what we call the clean energy scenario 2. It's the same. We still have, 50% RE share, but you can see that it jumped from 19 gigawatt, they wanted 50 gigawatt by 2050. So it just says there that they recognize, the government recognized the huge opportunity of really having a higher RE share if we, allocate more for offshore wind. And to be fair, if you look into the latest roadmap from World Bank, we have identified around 178 gigawatt of opportunity just for the Philippines alone in terms of offshore wind. And it's quite understandable. We're in the middle, almost middle of the sea. It's an archipelago. out of that 178 gigawatt, 80% are actually in deep waters and 20% in shallow. So 20% of that total opportunity would be fixed bottom, and then the rest would probably under the floating would be floating technology. So again, we were quite lucky because our government is already very supportive, and that we have an allocation already set for the offshore wind sector in the Philippines. And in that case, because when we entered the Philippines, we already have that support from the government. What GWEC did is to have this strategy until 2028, and looked in and further, still basing on the 4 pillars, but we have further segregated based on what we see as the key, I guess, priorities, let's call it that, for the Philippine market. So from 2024 until today, and until 2026, we plan to work on the offtake mechanism in the Philippines. We completely skipped the feed-in tariff for offshore wind, and our government went directly and said we will have auctions. They wanted competitive auction on the onset for offshore wind. Based through our continuous collaboration with the private sector, with the local association and the government, we pushed for an auction to be announced this year. Well, they have announced it already, but the final terms of reference for our first ever auction for offshore wind will happen this year. And we're looking at a 3.3 gigawatt of capacity from 2029 to 2030. So they just sort of limited it to 2030 first, and then we'll have a longer pipeline until 2035 or 2040 by next year. So that is again brought by continuous collaboration with the sector, with the developers, in identifying, well, if it's not feed-in tariff, if it's auction, then we should make it a bankable auction. So we really spent time with the banks, the developers, and the government in saying that, these are the things we want to see in the auction design. Who can participate? What are the requirements for the developers to participate? Do they need to have a technical study already? Do they need a commitment from the grid operator? How about the ports, and etc.? So those things we have discussed with the government, and they were able to come up with the terms of reference that we think the banks will accept in the future. Once they have awarded the offtake contract, we see the bank saying yes, because we have worked with the bank in designing that auction. So that is, I think, again, because we anyway have a target already, we sort of checked the first box, if you remember, out of the 4. So we moved to the second pillar, which is the route to market. So now we're sort of checking or ticking the box, because we now have the first offshore wind auction mobilized this year. We know that the government is planning for more auctions for offshore wind. So we're saying, okay, at least we have a route. We have a revenue mechanism for the developers to participate into. And we think that it's, there's a way for the market to further the risk, because government is working closely together with the sector. Okay, and then again, GWEC said, okay, it's not enough that we have the offtake mechanism there. We have to also understand, how about the ports, and how about other infra? So GWEC, again, working with the local association and the port authority, we're trying to mobilize a study in trying to understand how the private sector can come in. So I understand that other countries would have specific frameworks on who would develop the infrastructure. In the Philippines, the government owns and sometimes operates the port. But we don't have a port for offshore. There's no port in the Philippines that's ready for offshore wind. So we need to have private sector from other jurisdictions to participate and partner with the government. And that is what we're trying to also study and work on. How can we ensure that there's much private sector participation? What do we need to see to ensure that private sector sees this as an opportunity for them to participate in the Philippine market. Because there's really no experience for the Philippines. No one knows from the local sector knows how to build, how to design, how to construct, and how to operate an offshore wind port. So that's where our allies in UK, Denmark, and other countries that have done this before, we're enlisting their help to support us and how we can upgrade the existing ports in the Philippines to make it offshore wind ready. And then we're also looking into, as I've mentioned, capacity build out and probably including the floating technology in the future that goes, 2028 and beyond. We're also looking into advocacy, meaning, as Philippines is not yet included, we don't have a net zero target. We only have a coal repurposing ambition. So GWEC is also looking into if we could further, bring that to net zero for Philippines to be finally included in the JET-P mechanism or other advocacy relevant to offshore wind. And then the last two pillars we're working on, finance. As mentioned, we're working with the banks, multilaterals, commercial banks, development banks to understand risk-sharing mechanism. So we want to ensure that government understands the risk they're taking, developers also understand the risk that they're taking, and it's sort of shared between the two, right? So these de-risking mechanisms, we're having several workshops and we're sharing the GWEC platform for the banks, the developers, and the government to really talk how we can further reduce the risk. And hopefully by reducing the risk, we also reduce the cost of capital and the risk assignment for an emerging market like the Philippines. So we're releasing actually a paper on that this year to really just support that pillar, that finance pillar. And then lastly, this is the narrative, as I've mentioned, for the community. It's easy for the government and even the national agencies to understand why do we need to put offshore wind? Because it's to answer energy security, yes. Climate change, yes. But then if you go to the subnational and to the community, these are big words to them, right? I mean, we don't go and mobilize ourselves and talk to the communities and talk about energy security. But we need to talk to them about what are the socio-economic benefits of actually putting, offshore wind and the local industries in your area. This narrative they understand better, and that results to them accepting the project. So again, as part of the guardrail, again, if you remember the 4 pillars, as part of the guardrail or the principles, we're also working on reports and paper to touch on that. What's the socio-economic benefit? What's the gross value add? How many jobs will be added in our country if we mobilize 1 gigawatt or 10 gigawatt of offshore wind? What are the local industries that can be upgraded? So we have identified that in the Philippines, shipbuilding, steel, cement, critical minerals, those are key local industries in the Philippines that could be really invested on to support offshore wind deployment in the country. And then workforce as well. Remember, we don't have a robust workforce to support offshore wind, so we're starting now. We need to work with the academe. We need to work with the government. We need to work with the labor associations to really just understand who we can mobilize to support the construction and development of offshore wind. So these are coming from the 4 pillars for APAC. This is how we sort of contextualize this and turn this into a Philippine-focused strategy, which we've been doing and we intend to continue doing until 2028. And because we've been doing this until 2030, from 2023 and until now, you see here our sector stock taking, mid 2025. What we've seen because of the efforts of not just GWEC, this is a collaborative effort, local association, developers, GWEC, banks. The Philippine offshore wind sector has made significant stride across key development pillars, progress on permitting, infrastructure, financing, and policy reform. So what you see there is a snapshot of where the sector stands, right? Now we have a permitting guidebook released. Now we have an ongoing marine spatial plan efforts. Now we have the commitment from the government that they will invest on port and grid. Now we have a commitment from the commercial banks to work together with the developer to further the risk in the market. Now we have our agencies in the Philippine government agencies saying we need to look into green hub for metal or for any other industries that can support offshore wind. Now we have around what? I forgot the numbers, but now we have an uptake in green investments in the offshore wind sector in the Philippines. And again, finally, we now have the offtake mechanism for offshore wind. In terms of the capacity, that's 3.3 gigawatt until 2030 for offshore, and then 2 gigawatt just from 2026 to 2028. It's quite small compared to Vietnam, but to us in the Philippines, it's really a start to send the signal and the message that we're ready to mobilize offshore wind in the Philippines. And just an example, this is also available. I can send to Taiwi the link. Our Department of Energy just released the latest permitting guidebook, which really is what the developers will use when they do their consenting and permitting in the Philippines. So they have now reduced it. From what I remember, they streamlined it from 130 permits. Now we're down to 80. From around 2 years of pre-development timeline, we're now down to less than a year. And then further broken down to key permits, what we call the core permits, mandatory permits. We have the periphery permits like for foreign personnel incentives, and then we have the conditional permits. And this is relevant to if you're in a biodiverse area or you're in a protected area, then there are conditional permits that you need to get to. So it's now further streamlined, and we, the private sector developers, welcome this because it's easier now for the banks, for the developers to navigate through this very complex consenting system in the Philippines. And then since it's also published, then the banks would also have an understanding where you are right now in terms of your consenting. And they can all easily point to one framework and on how to guide them through the development process in the Philippines. And then what we would want to claim as a very big policy win, this is the first ever offshore wind technical working group. We have all the offshore wind developers led by GWEC and the local association. We always work with the local association, the main commercial banks in the Philippines, and the three multilaterals, ADB, IFC, and World Bank, all in one room with the regulators, and really just finalizing the terms of reference for the auction. What we have prepared as a position from the sector became the basis for the release of the Department of Energy in terms of the design for the first offshore wind auction in the Philippines. So now that that's checked, we're now waiting for the pricing because that's what we want, right? Okay, there's an auction, but what's the ceiling price? So we intend to also work for what we call as the GEAR, or the Green Energy Auction Reserve Price, which is the ceiling price for the Philippines. We don't have that yet, but from the last checking, we're now at what, 18 to 19 US cents as the ceiling price for the Philippines. It's not yet approved, but that's the range that we're looking at for the first fixed bottom projects in the Philippines. There will be a series of consultation with the technical working group and also the supply chain. But to us, basing it on the previous tariffs that we have, that is sort of an acceptable figure already for the developers. So we just need to hash out the details. And if all goes well, then we have 3.3 gigawatt capacity with a ceiling rate of what, 19 cents, 19 US dollar cents. So then developers would need to compete down because it's an auction. So that's the intent of the first offshore wind auction in the Philippines. Okay, so I'll pause there. I don't know if we want Q&A now, but I'll pause there quickly for the Philippines. But I wanted to highlight how we sort of followed the strategy, right? We worked on the capacity or pipeline. We worked on the route to market. We worked on the enablers, which are your infrastructure, supply chain, and we're touching on the community benefits as a principle. And the way we do it in Philippines with GWEC there is always the theory of change there is always top-bottom, bottom-up approach. We work with the national government, understanding what we can, sort of advocate for, but we always do it together with the local association. We don't go in a sector where we do it just us. We always work together with the local association because we understand that the local associations would have a better context on how to engage with the government and also how to engage with the community and the other stakeholders. So it's always GWEC working with the local association so that it's a more robust and strengthened strategy. So you see, in the Philippines, it's easy for us to bring everyone in the room, as I'm sure in Taiwan as well, bringing everyone in the same room because it's always a collaborative effort. So there, that's for the Philippines. Right now, for Vietnam, I'll try my best to, because I'm not, this is not my market, but I'll try my best to explain the strategy of the Vietnam team for offshore wind, for the offshore wind efforts. And similar to the Philippines, I want to give a snapshot of where they are right now in terms of the PDP-8. Very famous, no? PDP-8. The revised PDP-8 significantly raised Vietnam's 2030 power generation targets between 183 terawatt and 236, between that range, up from the original plan to meet rapidly growing energy demand. So the plan sharply boosts the RE ambition for Vietnam, especially for solar, and that includes rooftop and concentrated types. Also onshore or nearshore, onshore/nearshore wind. And of course, now they have a very specific allocation for offshore wind as well, which is between 6 to 17 terawatt. Gigawatt, sorry, 6 to 17 gigawatt. Energy storage is also scaled up dramatically based on the latest version of the PDP-8, with battery systems planned to grow from 300 megawatt to now between 10 and 16 gigawatts. So just a huge uptake even for the storage system, and that's by 2033. So the storage is specifically put there to enhance the grid reliability with all of these very aggressive RE expansion targets. Okay. And then they mentioned to me that, and you need to summarize what's happening, the overall development for offshore wind in Vietnam. So you can see here on your screen what are the relevant provisions made by the government in terms of offshore wind. So you see here, as mentioned earlier, there's a PDP-8 revision. That's April 2025. There's also a resolution on MSP, or the Marine Spatial Planning, released last year. So this one prioritizes offshore wind in coastal zones with a guidance on long-term infrastructure planning. They also saw the release of Decree 65 last March 2025, which then introduced the guidelines for the seabed allocation, site surveys, and exclusive licenses for up to 3 years. They have also the electricity law, amended last 2024, and the Decree 58. It now facilitates private investment. However, it mandates participation of SOEs, or state-owned entities, for foreign invested projects must include domestic or SOE-linked partners holding at least 5% of equity. And then there's also provision for non-competitive, allocation of projects, faster approvals only to state-owned energy-led projects while requiring competitive bidding for the rest. And then key offshore wind components under development, they're now looking into competitive auction mechanism and transparent pricing model, with completion expected in 2026. So GWEC is closely working with the government for this. and they're collaborating with MYT on the investor selection process. So that is an ongoing effort for the GWEC Vietnam team. Yeah, so you can see here the meeting done last year, was it? Yeah, so last year, November 7, you see here the MYT. No, this is Vice Minister Long and the GWEC Vietnam and Asia team. So they presented the paper that we did on the two-stage offshore wind auction framework. And it's two-stage because the proposal there is that for stage 1, there's an award for exclusive survey rights for at least 10 years. So that's the stage 1 component. And then the stage 2 component is the award of a PPA or an agreement with EVN and the price only competitive selection. So that's the off-take part of the auction. In that meeting and in that presentation of the paper of GWEC, Vice Minister Long actually acknowledged the two-stage auction and that they will carefully consider this framework to be rolled out in the Philippines, in Vietnam. However, there's a view that for Vietnam to reach the 6 gigawatt target from the PDP-8, there is a need for them to have a fast-track mechanism, which they now tag as the one-stage auction. So among the first 6 gigawatts, some projects will be directly awarded to state-owned entities, either EVN or PVN, and then the rest of the projects will go through a fast-track auction mechanism. There is a list there of what they think would be a challenge to these, one-stage auction. Number one, GWEC team thinks about the bankability of data. There's no comprehensive wind measurement, geophysical studies, or even geotechnical surveys available for possible investors. There's also a challenge on the auction and PPA uncertainty, meaning developers must bid under MOIT set price ceiling, which is also similar to the Philippines, right? There's a price ceiling, but there's a renegotiation stage, right? After the award, there's still an expectation for a renegotiation further to decrease the price further, and there is no bankable template yet being released. There's also a challenge on the timeline that we're in. Winners only have 24 months to do the surveys and then 6 months to finalize the PPA. And then in terms of the price range gap, there's no clear structure for auction, the price for auction, and projects may not start construction until 3+ years later. So that misalignment of the award and when they could start the construction is a huge, GWEC sees that as a huge challenge. And then, of course, similar to other markets like the Philippines, there's also an issue on the infrastructure. Grid and port capacity might be insufficient to support offshore wind construction and dispatch. Okay, and yeah, so GWEC is working with a consultant to provide more inputs for MOIT on the framework of one-stage offshore wind auction in Vietnam. If we look into the whole timeline or process for Vietnam right now, the development begins with site survey allocation, either directly to the SOE or via a selection process for qualified developers. The applicants must prove their technical and financial capability. They need to secure clearances and submit approved survey plans. These survey results covering wind resource and seabed data must be then delivered to the government, to the authorities, and will further inform the subsequent project proposal stage. So I think there's that issue on the bankability of that data. And then once surveys are complete, investor selection follows, either through direct assignment or a competitive bidding, which again is still now being finalized on how they want to do that competitive bidding process, and it will be run by MOIT. And relevant to the price, GWEC is the only organization that's able to provide MOIT with the latest CAPEX and OPEX estimates when it comes to offshore wind technology in Vietnam. We were requested to support the calculation of the offshore wind price ceiling, again, similar to the Philippines. So we've been working with OWC, which is a consultant, our advisor, to estimate the CAPEX and the OPEX in Vietnam. And from the recent reports, they've found out, or they have established this range for Vietnam, CAPEX at 4 to 4.5 million per megawatt, and OPEX at $70 to $84,000 per megawatt annually, depending on which regions in Vietnam. Now, these estimates and that report actually excluded Chinese contractors because we have very, very limited visibility of the figures outside China. So that CAPEX and OPEX is actually just actually considering European supply chain as of the moment. So just some exclusion there for the cost estimation for your further detail. But we need to also point out that GWEC is not suggesting the per kilowatt hour price to the government right now. They just provided the cost assumptions, and I think it's an ongoing process for the government to, which cost assumption range they would follow and what will be the resulting tariff or ceiling price for offshore wind in Vietnam. So that report is actually given and explained to MOIT this year. Okay, that said, again, it's a continuing effort in Vietnam, but what we've seen and what we believe, there are huge improvements from last year, essentially. And although the whole process now, there's still much development to do, we have identified here key challenges for deploying offshore wind in Vietnam. Again, one, I've mentioned about the site survey or the bankability of the data. So here it's further detailed why we see this as a challenge. So the government is expected to lead site identification and surveys and etc. But there's really not much resource to do it, and there's really not much technical capacity for the government to support this process. In many provinces in Vietnam as well, resource expertise are also limited. So as a result, again, the data might be unbankable, might be incomplete or completely unreliable. So the consequence for that is that the developers now would be participating in an auction wherein they didn't do the site survey, they didn't do the process, the technical process for that. It would be difficult for them to sort of submit, their bid based on that data. So the recommendation, and this is based on GWEC's discussion with the developers in Vietnam, is for them to accelerate the development. The government should establish a system that removes the site survey from them and allocate that or allow the developers to conduct their own, so that developers know the process, it's reliable from their point of view, but there needs to be a clear guideline on how to do this. So that's a GWEC recommendation to the government relevant to the site surveys and the bankability of site surveys in Vietnam. Then the second challenge, again, as mentioned earlier, developers can bid, they have a price, but then there's an expectation of renegotiation, further bringing down the price or the PPA price between developer and the government. So that's the current situation right now, meaning the final PPA may differ from the proposal from the developers. And as a result, developers cannot fully assess the financial viability at the time of auction. So, of course, that's a huge risk, investment risk, uncertainty. It reduces the attractiveness of the auction for really serious investors in Vietnam. So the recommendation from GWEC is that remove the post-bidding negotiation. Whatever was bid by the developer and was accepted by the government should serve as the final and the fixed tariff for that specific development. And there's expectation of a standardized PPA to be released and developed by the government. Okay, so I'll stop there for Vietnam. Again, feel free to ask me later. We could give more details on what we do in Philippines and Vietnam. But the approach is kind of similar, no? It's a different market, yes, but it's always the top-bottom and bottom-up approach. And what we've seen in Vietnam, what they have regular workshops with not just the government, but also the private sector. What they submit to MOIT and etc. is always based on a position coming from the developers and the sector, the offshore wind sector. And it's good that GWEC is able to get that position or that platform wherein the government actually taps GWEC to provide them technical assistance. And that's what we've seen in the 2-stage, 1-stage, and even the price ceiling process right now. GWEC sort of, gives that support to the government before they finalize the process behind it. Okay, so that's for the Vietnam and the Philippines. The next slides will just have a few, maybe just sharing on why we think we need to work on supply chain in APAC region and also finance, and then that's it for me. Okay, it's quite long, but really the context here is APAC region already leads the global wind market because of China. And we see much opportunity from other emerging markets such as Philippines, Vietnam, South Korea, and Japan. And this region is expected to deliver 61% of new capacity through 2030, which you've seen in the graph earlier. Yet, outside China, installation rates fall short of the 1.5 degrees Celsius targets, with high concentration risk in current supply chain, meaning we're all getting it from one place. Rising costs and macroeconomic pressures have pushed governments to localize and strengthen supply chains, but offshore wind, this is still it's a new technology for most APAC countries, right? Even for Vietnam. It has complex requirements that few can meet alone. And to us, GWEC, that's the reason why we want to work on the supply chain is because we believe regional collaboration is essential, enabling shared investment confidence. We want a coordinated solution and approach to infrastructure and skills and workforce. And we want to unlock together the full socio-economic potential of the sector. So we want to do it on a regional scale, right? Instead of the strategies being, you have your country-specific strategies, we still want to bring it to the regional scale and understand, can we do a North Sea Alliance type of collaboration and bring that to APAC? So this is a question we're trying to answer with all of our APAC supply chain reports. And very quickly, this is essentially what, again, as what I mentioned, this is what we want to achieve, if possible. If the North Seas would have that, if we can see the North Sea cooperation and how it was successful in deploying offshore wind in that area, perhaps an APAC cooperation and supply chain might also work. But for us to understand that, we have to go through all of these studies, and that's what we're doing right now. We're trying to understand the baseline capabilities of each country, and see how we can further extend and expand the industrial framework for those countries. And then the second part is, now that we know, can the governments work together to achieve this? So that's a question that, again, we want to find out in the next years or so. And we're starting with that part, the market development part. So this one is the market development part. The second part, or the middle part of that slide is an example of a report that we produced, especially that one, the top. Wherein it's also available in our website. But what that says, all the green, the yellow, the red, it identifies the country in APAC. And it says there are countries that are ready. There are industries in a specific country that would be ready to support offshore wind. That's your green. But there are also industries wherein it's totally not ready to support. And then there are oranges and yellows that are in the middle. So we've done that for China, which is all green. There's no surprise because we're getting everything in China, from China. We did South Korea, we did Japan, we did Vietnam, Philippines, Indonesia, Australia. So all of these countries, we try to understand the capabilities of the local industries, right? And what we found out is that very few within APAC can actually right now support local deployment of offshore wind, except for China. Even South Korea and Japan would have green there, but others are still on a yellow or red. So what does it say? It means that we have a gap if we look at the supply chain in APAC. But also, there's an opportunity to build on and switch the orange and the yellow ones to green if we understand the competitive advantages of each country. So for example, we found out that Korea can concentrate on a specific industry, then maybe they can build on that industry and not just support Korea, but can support other countries in APAC. So similar story for Philippines, Vietnam, until we reach a situation wherein the trade between the countries is made possible because we have identified the competitive advantages. And that's not just on the equipment, but also on the workforce. For example, Philippines, we found out that, well, we don't have the manpower now to support offshore wind in the country, but we have good and skilled marine workers. That's all outside the Philippines. So maybe there's a way to create Philippines or have Philippines as a workforce hub wherein we build training centers and have training efforts from other from other countries and then serve not just the Philippines but APAC. So that's sort of the vision for GWEC. But again, we need to further understand what each country can bring when it comes to the offshore wind supply chain in the APAC region. And and this is again what we wanted to achieve, right? Similar to North Sea, similar to how the wind components are sort of used in the US. Hopefully, in the future, we have an understanding of what Vietnam can bring, what other countries can bring, and how to facilitate G2G or a per country type of trade flow, very specific to wind components. But that's the vision. How to get there is what we're trying to find out. So that's somehow a vision that we wanted to do for APAC. Yeah. So long-term outcomes. Again, we want to create a North Sea alliance of sort. We want to establish bilateral and multilateral trade agreements within the region. We want a regional cooperation to facilitate ease of cross-border electricity trade and joint projects, regional grid integration, that's still an ongoing discussion, regional specific marine spatial planning, financial package that support an APAC or regional framework, coordinated ambitious targets wherein instead of looking at 3 gigawatt in the Philippines, X gigawatt from Vietnam, maybe it's X gigawatt from APAC. So that brings a strengthened, I guess, pipeline that goes beyond the country and look at the region on a high level scale and regional alignment in other issues such as carbon market and standardization efforts. So we still don't have the report for that. We intend to release that this year and next reports in the coming years. But just to note that we're mobilizing that kind of report and study from GWEC. And lastly, for me, for this presentation, again, we're working on the finance work stream as well, or finance pillar. We will also be releasing a report within the year that really looks into the state of the current state of blended finance in APAC, particularly the availability of concessional capital and industry, and also trying to understand the industry sentiment on analyzing the specific challenges, trade-offs, and opportunities for financing offshore wind. So this year we will be releasing this, and we hope to present a detailed replicable capital stack model for a 500 megawatt offshore wind project. So we want to go beyond the 70-30 capital stack that we see for project financing. We want this report to spur commitments from the MDB to insert more concessionality in that capital stock to further bring down the cost of offshore wind development in the region. Okay. Yeah, so this one is again, just putting out there all the available reports from GWEC, again, focused on finance and probably something that, this sector could look into. It's just assessing the cost competitiveness of offshore wind. We've seen so many reports on how we're expecting the cost of offshore wind to go down. We've seen Bloomberg reports as well, pointing to that direction. And this is just a report that could further strengthen the narrative on why offshore wind and how competitive offshore wind is in terms of the cost. So you can you can download and just read it and try to see if that makes sense, especially for an emerging market like Thailand. And promise this is the last. I am instructed to share our flagship summit, the APAC Wind Energy Summit. This time we are bringing this back to Australia, in Melbourne in particular. This will be from September 16 to 18, wherein we will bring industry leaders, policymakers, governments, institutions together to discuss what we need to do to accelerate wind deployment in the region. So again, this is in Melbourne, September 16 to 18. There is a QR code here if ever you're interested, but I will end my presentation with this one. So thank you so much for listening. I know it's kind of hard to take all in, but again, thank you for inviting, and I will be there sitting if you have other questions relevant to Philippines, Vietnam, or our regional works. Thank you, Kapag Kara. Thank you.
เราจะมีเวลาอีกสักแป๊บหนึ่งสำหรับ Q&A นะครับเชื่อว่าหลายๆท่านคงจะมีคำถามเกี่ยวกับสิ่งที่เกิดขึ้นในฟิลิปปินส์หรือว่าในเวียดนามหรือว่าเรื่องทั่วไปในอุตสาหกรรม Offshore Wind นะครับผมเปิดให้ละกันนะครับเผื่อว่าคนอื่นจะได้คิดไปก่อนว่าจะพูดเรื่องอะไรดีนะครับ so Anne, the first question will come from me. If I remember correctly from your table, you expect the first offshore wind farm to be operational in the Philippines in 2028. Is that the plan? Is it still happening?
Well, that's a qualified no, because there's I'd say 2028 is there to sort of kick off the sector. I think the expectation really is that we need to see something in water by 2028, not the full COD or an operational plant. From our discussion with the developers, from this very aggressive timeline, they can see a 2030 full operation. 2028 will be start of construction. So, but the government released an auction wherein it's a single lot, meaning 2028 to 2030. So there's no capacity allotted for 2028, 2029, and 2030. So it's one single lot with 3 years, so 2028 to 2030. So meaning developers can actually bid for an operation by 2030. Everyone can actually choose to go to 2030 or 2029. So they just sort of gave that year range for the developers to work into. So yeah.
ครับก็2028อาจจะได้วางศิลาฤกษ์กัน COD จริงๆจะ2030ครับยังไงก็ถือว่าอีกไม่นานแล้วนะครับกว่าจะทำ policy กว่าจะทำเรื่องอื่นๆเนี่ยใช้เวลานานมากเลยอย่างที่ ทุกคนได้ฟังกันว่านอกจากจะมีการแบ่งโควต้านอกจากจะมีการคัดเลือกแล้วเนี่ยยังมี policy อื่นที่เกี่ยวข้องอีกเยอะแยะเลยที่เขาเล่าให้ฟังนะครับว่าจะแบ่งกันยังไงจะมีขั้นตอนยังไงนะครับก็หวังว่าของเราจะมีเวลาพอที่จะทำได้ตามแผนของเรานะครับตอนนี้คิดว่าทุกท่านคงพอเริ่มมีไอเดียกันแล้วใครมีคำถามรบกวนยกมือเลยครับ questions
So for the Philippines that you share, has the government or someone make a master plan about how and where things will develop and open up according to that master plan? Because I think one of the costly thing would be the transmission and also where you're gonna land and how you're gonna connect further.
Correct.
Which will the government invest on that or how it gonna be proceed?
Okay. So maybe we can take a step back for the Philippines. The process for awarding sites in the Philippines is very different. It's not a two-stage or one-stage auction as we know it. In the Philippines, there's a process wherein we call the service contracts award. So what the developers will do is to sort of apply for a site in the Philippines, and then submit an initial report on it, submit their technical capability as a developer and a proof of financial capability, have that submitted to our Department of Energy. Our Department of Energy will assess. If they see you as a worthy developer, they will award you exclusive rights to that site for the next 25 years. So that's what we call the service contract. Now, for offshore wind, the developer, the private sector movement was done first before any marine spatial planning was rolled out. So it was the other way around. The interest from the developer were communicated first before any planning was done by the government. So they followed the usual route wherein they allowed the developers to apply, and if there's no conflict, they see that developers can move forward with the construction. They sort of look into the capability of these developers. Then they award for the next 25 years. And that's what happened in the Philippines from 2019 to 2021, wherein sans any marine spatial planning or a master plan, the sites were already awarded. And in the middle of that awarding, that's when the government sort of said, we need to have a marine spatial plan so we can properly plan out what to do in the offshore wind space or marine space. So that's what they did. In the middle of already a 65 gigawatt of sites awarded in the Philippines, they're now finalizing a marine spatial plan to identify the constraints, if there are places in the Philippines that are risky. And then they will talk to the developers on how to assess the risk. Included in that marine spatial plan are the potential connecting points as well to sort of answer the challenge on the transmission. And in that marine spatial plan as well will be the priority ports where the government are planning to upgrade or construct ports to support offshore wind development. So that's now, that's what's happening in the Philippines. But to be fair to our developers, part of their initial assessment is to also identify sites wherein there's a nearby transmission substation or there's a nearby port infrastructure. So all the priority projects that are moving now in the Philippines we see that there's a place for them to connect to, and there's an existing port wherein the government committed to upgrading. So there will be available infrastructures for these first developers or first movers in the Philippines. So yeah, but the government has not yet released this final marine spatial planning. So they intend to release that within the year, and ongoing discussion with the developers on how it might affect the sites awarded to them.
You haven't talked about the price yet.
Price?
You haven't talked about the FIT price yet. So how do how do these developers compete against each other?
You mean the process for?
Yeah, for selection, how do you choose which developer would get this part of sea area?
Yeah, because again, in the Philippines, it's not similar to the two-stage auction as we know it, right?
Yeah.
So the auction actually is open to everyone that has an awarded site, so long as they think that they can develop their projects using that ceiling price. So the 3.3 gigawatt set is not to a specific location. It's open to everyone that were awarded a site already. So the main, I guess, driver for the developers to pursue or submit their bid is, one, they think that they can survive for the next 20 years using that ceiling price, or they can compete using that ceiling price. So and based on our discussion with the developers at 18 to 19 US dollar cents, if the government would use that ceiling price, we're looking at around 3 to 5 gigawatt of developers that will probably join the first round of auction. And where they are right now, I mean, there are key locations in the Philippines that would be able to, construct. We have identified 3 priority zones in the Philippines that probably will join that first auction. So, but yeah, it's not location based, unlike in Vietnam, wherein they have a price in the north, and here it's one price for everyone essentially.
What I'm not sure I get it is that the area
Yeah.
already awarded
Yes.
to several developers,
Correct.
and they have that right for 25 years.
Correct. Correct.
Now, they will submit if they think it's economic
Correct.
using that 18 or 19
Correct.
cent,
Correct. Correct.
and the government will look at the plan.
Correct.
Ah,
Correct. So
Okay.
so in other jurisdiction, the auction is done for the site first, right? I mean, you have other jurisdiction wherein the first stage of auction is they auction the seabed for a lease. So that didn't happen in the Philippines, right? There's no auction for the seabed lease. There's only an application. So that's why the government, when there's an application, they just review and monitor, they award it. The auction talks about the off-take auction, which is the PPA. So it's now open to all the developers that have received a site for the next 25 years. So in the Philippines, when we talk about auction, it's only relevant to off-take auction.
ครับสรุปให้นิดนึงนะครับจากที่เขาว่ามาเนี่ยก็คืออย่างที่ฟิลิปปินส์เนี่ยมันจะไม่เหมือนที่อื่นก็คือถ้าคุณเป็น developer คุณก็ยื่นไปว่าผมอยากได้ที่ seabed ตรงนี้นะครับแล้วก็ถ้าเกิดว่าเอกสารคุณดีพอคุณก็จะได้พื้นที่นั้นไปเนี่ย25 ปีนะครับแล้วคุณก็มีสิทธิ์ตรงนั้นแล้วหลังจากนั้นจะมี auction กันคุณก็ไปดูเอาว่าที่ของคุณเนี่ยมันทำราคาได้เท่าไหร่แล้วค่อยไปบิดกันตรงนั้นนะครับซึ่งก็เป็นวิธีแปลกๆแต่ละที่เนี่ยก็มีวิธีการของตัวเองไม่เหมือนกันใช่ไหมครับมีข้อจำกัดของตัวเองเราก็ศึกษาไว้แล้วเดี๋ยวเรามา brainstorm กันช่วงบ่ายนะครับมีคำถามอีกไหมครับ
Hi. Maybe building up from what you've mentioned about the wind energy service contract, do you have any historic record of the megawatt that actually achieved COD from the initial conception of granting the wind energy service contract, maybe for onshore wind at least? Do you think that that kind of proportion or share can be translated to offshore wind? And the reason that I ask this because in the case that, for example, the best case, all projects that receive wind energy service contract get COD, and then there's multiple projects that are located in the same vicinity. Is there any framework that is being planned to mitigate any negative impact from competition, wage compensation agreement, like we may be experiencing in Taiwan, for example?
For onshore wind, let's look at that. I mean, the whole runway from auction to actual operation actually goes beyond sometimes 3 years up to 5 years. And that's because of the whole consenting, permitting, right of way, and etc. So for offshore wind, we actually want to be realistic around it. I mean, if we have now is 2025, and we're looking at, let's say, possibly 2030. That's 5 years. If we're looking at 5 years for onshore, then the next probably sentiment there is that even possible for offshore wind, considering it's a new technology. And in as much as we want to be, well, let's not call it that. We want to be optimistic around it because the government is committing to that, and that's why the whole of government approach is, being employed by up to the president to ensure that we have a streamlined permitting. The auction will consider infrastructures in terms of the design of how to conduct the auction for the next years or so, and that's including the commitment for the port and the transmission. What we still don't have is, after this 3.3 gigawatt, how the collective, I mean, not the collective, but the effect of actually putting much capacity in a specific substation or transmission connecting point, and how will that affect the pipeline of projects. What we know is that we are working, the Department of Energy, in terms of the systems planning, is working with the port operator to ensure that it's capable actually in terms of, getting the capacity, and not just for offshore wind, but all the other RE technologies in the Philippines. We have a standing transmission development plan. In terms of the framework for that, we're still expecting a release of what they call the Smart Green Grid Plan, which would hopefully highlight how we can fast track transmission development, and also sort of trying to understand if private participation would be possible to fast track all of these investments. But we don't have that now yet. So it's in the works, I guess, is the short answer to that. What else? But we recognize how aggressive the target is. There's a recognition even from the banks, right? Even if we see the developer saying, yes, we will participate, and even if we see the bank saying, yes, we can finance, it's fully caveated. The whole design for offshore wind auction is fully caveated on the capability of the government to deliver the infrastructure. So you'd see the developer saying, like, CIP, which is, I guess, I could name as the most aggressive in the Philippines, saying we can only commit to 2030 or start of construction by 2029 if, and only if, we see port, and the port should be coming from the government, and only if we see a commitment from NGCP. Without all of those, then that whole commitment will just go away. So it's fully caveated on what the government can deliver first before we can actually go to the developers and ask for that operational plan. So I think there's an understanding between the government and the private sector that and the auction was designed that way. There's a clear language on what we need to see first in terms of the commitment before the developers can commit. So that is somehow captured in the auction design. But the individual framework coming from ports and transmission, we have yet to see that happening or being released at the very least.
Okay. And maybe a little bit of a follow-up question from that. And this is connecting to the 19 US cent per kilowatt hour price ceiling that you mentioned.
Yeah.
So do you see any similar characteristic for maybe for a developers or an owner that would be comfortable to bid under this price ceiling? For example, is it international developer or is it local developer that can leverage local maybe capabilities?
Yeah.
Is it localization of contractors or using international contractors, or maybe a large megawatt of up to 1 gigawatt, or maybe a small 50 megawatt projects? Any similarities in the characteristic that is willing to bid under this price ceiling?
Yeah. Maybe the first, I'd say, driver for that is one, they talked about the location. So there are near shore location in the Philippines, and we see the developers being aggressive. What's common to them is that they're in that type of location, meaning it's kind of still shallow enough and still would have an acceptable distance from the shore, wherein there's no need for an offshore substation. So that again removes a part of the capex that would bring it lower. because they can directly connect to the onshore substation from the main grid operator. And we see that in one or two key zones in the Philippines. And the developers that have sites in that area all said the same thing. We have lower capex because of that. And fortunately, the substation, the transmission in those areas are higher than 230 kV. So there's an availability of the 500 kV line that enables them to directly connect. So to them, the key driver would be where their locations are at. And that's one. And second, there's a clear understanding from the developers in the Philippines right now, at least what we call the front runners, that for this first auction, everything will probably come from China. So where the source is also a relevant driver to that. And it's not, again, I go back to CIP because we know them as a global player. In other jurisdictions, they've used Vestas and they have a standing relationship with the European value chain. But for an emerging market like the Philippines, it seems like getting Vestas and Gamesa wouldn't be possible for the first round because of what you mentioned, the pipeline. It's not enough. For them, 3.3 is not enough. But Chinese suppliers are willing to supply to that. So that driver of where the components would come from would have a huge effect on their decision on why they're saying they can make it at below 19 and can compete with that ceiling price in mind. So two key drivers for them committing to a sort of an aggressive timeline and also an aggressive pricing.
มีท่านครับขอบคุณมากครับเดี๋ยวเราคงมีเวลาอีกสักหนึ่งท่านถามคำถามนะครับยังไงเชิญเลยครับ
Just want to ask about the guideline and standard. Since I saw in your slide, page 13 has a lot of approval process. Do you have any specific guideline or you use international one?
Is this?
Yeah, this one.
And then you talked about
the standard and guidelines because you have several process of approval.
Yeah, I mean the consultant for our Department of Energy and our Department of Environment and Natural Resources, understanding and noting that most of the project financing would come from outside the country, and that would involve your international banks. They made sure that it's almost, I wouldn't say 100%, but almost aligned with the global standards when it comes to EIA. For example, the EIA consenting relevant to the environment, biodiversity, etc., equator principle. So they sort of aligned it, but also again did not completely remove the context behind local permitting. So they just want to ensure that additional parameters when looking into environmental consenting are added into what's already there, so that when the developers go through this and present it to the bank, it's bankable. So they used international standards when it comes to other components of the permitting, and other more localized, for example, labor and etc. We have anyway our laws and frameworks, they sort of retained.
Okay, it means there are two processes. One is the on the financial part with the bank,
Yeah.
and another part with the authority. That international standard also acceptable, plus local requirement.
Yes. Well, this whole when this was prepared, they thought of further streamlining it based on the development cycle of the offshore wind project. So they have a specific permitting guideline for when the developers would undergo the pre-development, as what we call it, development, construction, operation, and then post-operation. So these development cycle would have their own specific permitting.
Yeah.
What I was saying is that when they created this, they have the international banks as project financing or as lenders in mind. So the way they created the pre-dev, the dev, construction is aligned with the global standards, so that when developers go through these and when they start talking to lenders, they can confidently say that they're aligned with the global standards when it comes to these permitting. So, for example, under the pre-dev and the dev, most of our environment and social permits are within those two phases. So our EIA, all of those permits would be on those two. When the developers would then go through that process and when they present it to the lenders, they can confidently say that we followed the new guidelines from the Philippines, and this new guideline followed the international guidelines when we talk about environments and social permits. So it's not saying that banks are included, but the way they created the framework had that lender point of view in mind, and they aligned it in such a way that it's, again, you have the global standards somewhere out there. I can't say it's 100%, right? But there's an alignment done, and several consultants were also consulted. And these consultants worked on other jurisdictions and places wherein they have mobilized offshore wind in that sector. So they have, used these best practices to sort of, align what we have currently. So they came up with this new one, a more streamlined but globally aligned permitting for offshore wind. But they've only done this for offshore wind. For our solar, all other onshore technologies we use are existing one, which we think, the local commercial banks are comfortable. We do have local financing anyway for onshore wind and onshore technologies, but for offshore wind, we need to create something that is made financeable by, outside the Philippines. So.
And I guess this is available on your website to download?
Not our website, but from the Department of Energy website, they can download this. It would give you a more detailed and granular permitting and who are the key agencies and also the timeline required for the agencies to release the specific permit.
ครับแล้วเราเองก็คงจะต้องมีเป็นไกด์ไลน์อย่างนี้เหมือนกันสำหรับของเราเพราะมันก็ซับซ้อนพอสมควรนะครับนั่นคือสิ่งหนึ่งที่เราตั้งใจว่าจะทำในปีถัดไปนะครับโดยสมาคมก็จะขอให้สมาชิกแล้วก็พวกเกี่ยวข้องทุกท่านมาช่วยกันทำแล้วก็เสนอไปให้มันเกิดขึ้นนะครับไงขอขอบคุณมากนะครับ Please give a round of applause to Anne. Thank you. ครับหลังจากนี้เป็นการพักแป๊บหนึ่งนะครับเรามีเบรกกัน10 นาทีนะครับเข้าใจว่ามีอาหารเบรกอยู่ด้านหน้านะครับแล้วก็ขอร้องว่าช่วยกลับมาให้ตรงเวลานิดหนึ่งนะครับก็ออกได้เลยนะครับเข้าห้องน้ำหาขนมกินแล้วก็เข้ามานั่งกินข้างในได้นะครับขอบคุณมากครับ